On Saturday, 26 December 1944, as the winter sun struggled to rise over the frozen forests of the Ardennes, General George S. Patton stood inside a cramped command post, studying maps smeared with mud and pencil marks, while the sound of artillery echoed in the distance. The date marked a critical turning point in World War II. Because the German surprise offensive had stalled, American units were bleeding, and the margin for error had vanished. What unfolded next would reveal a truth rarely acknowledged at the time. Segregated black soldiers, long confined to labor and support roles, were about to play a decisive part in helping Patton break through German lines when the U.S. Army had no other options left. The Ardennes offensive had caught the Allied command off guard earlier that month, exploiting thinly held sectors and brutal winter weather. German units pushed deep into American positions, surrounding towns, cutting supply lines, and forcing commanders into desperate improvisation. Patton's Third Army, positioned to the south, received orders to pivot north with unprecedented speed to relieve besieged units. This maneuver required not only tactical brilliance, but manpower, logistics, and endurance on a scale that strained the limits of the American Army in World War II. By late December, infantry casualties were mounting, and replacement systems could not keep pace with losses. Entire regiments were under strength, while thousands of trained soldiers remained in segregated units, officially restricted from frontline combat. These men drove trucks, built roads, unloaded ships, and guarded depots, performing work essential to the war effort, yet denied the chance to fight. The contradiction between need and policy became impossible to ignore as Patton prepared his counteroffensive. The U.S. Army had entered World War II committed to segregation, reflecting broader American society rather than battlefield logic. Black soldiers were organized into separate units, led mostly by white officers, and assigned roles deemed appropriate by prevailing racial assumptions. Combat leadership, especially in infantry formations, was considered unsuitable, despite evidence from earlier conflicts that contradicted such beliefs. As the Ardennes crisis deepened, these assumptions collided with reality. Patton was not known for progressive views on race, yet he was acutely pragmatic when it came to combat effectiveness. Facing a shortage of riflemen and pressure to act quickly, he authorized the formation of provisional infantry platoons drawn from black service units. This decision was not ideological, it was driven by necessity. In World War II, necessity often forced commanders to abandon doctrine in favor of survival. Volunteers were called for, and thousands of black soldiers stepped forward, aware that the opportunity carried both risk and significance. They underwent accelerated infantry training, learning weapons handling, small unit tactics, and battlefield movement under harsh winter conditions. The speed of this preparation reflected the urgency of the moment, as Patton's timetable left no room for prolonged instruction. These men would be sent into combat not as symbols, but as reinforcements for depleted white units. The integration that followed was limited and unofficial, yet it marked a quiet departure from established practice. Black platoons were attached to white companies, filling gaps in the line where casualties had hollowed out formations. Commanders focused on immediate effectiveness rather than long-term policy implications. In World War II, the battlefield often became a testing ground where social rules bent under pressure. As Patton's forces advanced northward, they encountered stiff German resistance entrenched along forested ridges and villages turned into defensive strongpoints. Fighting was close, brutal, and confused, with visibility limited by snow and terrain. The newly integrated black soldiers entered this environment with little margin for error, aware that their performance would be scrutinized more harshly than that of others. Accounts from the front describe these soldiers moving forward under fire, clearing foxholes, holding defensive positions, and enduring the same hardships as their comrades. Cold, exhaustion, and fear were universal, but so was determination. In World War II, combat effectiveness depended less on background than on cohesion, training, and leadership under fire, and these soldiers demonstrated all three. German units defending the Ardennes were experienced and desperate, fighting to delay the Allied advance long enough to salvage strategic advantage. Breaking through their lines required sustained pressure across multiple axes, supported by artillery, armor, and infantry working in coordination. The additional manpower provided by segregated black soldiers allowed Patton's units to maintain momentum where they might otherwise have stalled. Logistics played a critical role in this advance. Supply routes had to be reopened and protected as forces pushed forward, and black support units continued to perform these tasks, even as some of their members fought on the front lines. This dual contribution underscored the interconnected nature of modern warfare in World War II, where combat and support functions were inseparable. The psychological impact of this integration was significant. White soldiers who had previously accepted segregation as normal encountered black comrades sharing the same risks and responsibilities. Initial skepticism often gave way to respect forged under fire, as survival depended on mutual trust. These interactions, though limited in scope, challenged assumptions ingrained by policy and culture. Patton's drive north succeeded in relieving surrounded units and restoring the Allied front. While no single group could claim sole credit, the contribution of black soldiers in these improvised infantry roles was real and measurable. They filled gaps, absorbed casualties, and enabled maneuver at a moment when failure could have prolonged the war. In World War II, such contributions often went undocumented, overshadowed by larger narratives of strategy and leadership. Official recognition for these soldiers was minimal at the time. After the crisis passed, many were returned to their previous roles, and segregation remained intact. Yet the precedent had been set. Combat performance under the most demanding conditions had exposed the weakness of arguments used to justify exclusion. The battlefield had rendered its verdict, even if institutions were slow to acknowledge it. Patton himself rarely spoke publicly about this episode, and when he did, his language reflected the contradictions of his character and era. Nevertheless, his willingness to deploy black soldiers in combat when circumstances demanded revealed an implicit recognition of their capability. In World War II, such implicit acknowledgments often preceded formal change. The Ardennes experience became part of the evidence considered in post-war evaluations of military policy. Analysts reviewing manpower utilization noted that segregated units represented an untapped resource during crises. The success of provisional integration during Patton's advance added weight to arguments for reform, contributing indirectly to later decisions on desegregation. For the soldiers involved, the experience left lasting impressions. They had fought, bled, and endured alongside others, proving their worth in the most direct way possible. Returning to segregated roles afterward underscored the gap between demonstrated ability and institutional acceptance. This tension reflected a broader pattern in World War II, where progress was often uneven and incomplete. Historical research has gradually brought these stories to light, drawing on unit records, personal accounts, and after-action reports. By examining the Ardennes campaign through this lens, historians gain a more complete understanding of how victory was achieved. The role of segregated black soldiers in Patton's breakthrough illustrates how necessity can expose the flaws of rigid systems. Educational analysis of this episode emphasizes the relationship between policy and performance. When ideology constrained manpower use, effectiveness suffered. When necessity forced adaptation, results improved. This lesson, grounded in the realities of World War II, extends beyond military history into broader discussions of organizational behavior under stress. The experience also highlighted the moral complexity of wartime decisions. Integration occurred not because equality had been embraced, but because survival demanded it. Yet the outcomes challenged assumptions that had justified inequality. In World War II, such contradictions were common, as democratic ideals coexisted uneasily with discriminatory practices. As Patton's army continued its advance into Germany, the contribution of these soldiers remained largely unacknowledged in official narratives. Nevertheless, their actions formed part of the cumulative pressure that drove German forces back and hastened the end of the war. Each mile gained carried the imprint of countless individual efforts, many of them unseen. The legacy of this moment extends into the post-war era, where veterans drew on their service to demand recognition and rights. The Ardennes became not only a battlefield, but a reference point in arguments for change. World War II had exposed the inconsistency between national ideals and military practice, and experiences like this sharpened that awareness. Understanding how segregated black soldiers helped Patton break through German lines requires moving beyond simplified stories of command and maneuver. It demands attention to manpower decisions made under pressure, to individuals thrust into combat by circumstance, and to the ways performance can challenge prejudice. These dynamics were not peripheral to World War II, they were embedded in its conduct. The advance north in December 1944 demonstrated that effectiveness emerges when capability is recognized and employed, regardless of preconceived limits. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the U.S. Army confronted both an external enemy and internal constraints. The way those constraints were temporarily set aside reveals as much about the war as any famous battle plan, and the implications of that moment continue to unfold through history. The broader operational context of Patton's advance reveals how fragile the Allied position remained even after initial breakthroughs were achieved. German rearguard actions, scorched earth tactics, and the destruction of bridges slowed progress and forced constant improvisation. In this environment, manpower flexibility became as important as firepower. The temporary use of segregated black soldiers in combat roles did not solve every problem, but it reduced strain on exhausted units and allowed commanders to sustain pressure across a wide front, a necessity in World War II maneuver warfare. Reports from regimental and battalion commanders noted that once engaged, these soldiers adapted quickly to frontline realities. Many had already experienced danger through exposure to air attacks, artillery fire near supply routes, and the harsh conditions of forward logistics work. Transitioning to infantry combat intensified these risks, but did not introduce fear unknown to them. In World War II, familiarity with danger often mattered more than the specific nature of one's assignment, and this familiarity contributed to their effectiveness under fire. The integration also exposed inconsistencies within Army training doctrine. Pre-war assumptions held that only certain populations could master infantry skills, yet accelerated programs demonstrated that motivated soldiers could learn essentials rapidly when properly instructed. This finding mirrored other wartime adaptations, such as shortened officer training courses and rapid technical instruction for specialized roles. World War II repeatedly showed that rigid peacetime standards gave way under the pressure of total war. German intelligence reports from the period focused on Allied strength and movement rather than internal composition, underscoring that enemy forces judged effectiveness by results rather than racial makeup. Defensive positions were abandoned or overrun based on firepower and coordination, not the identity of the soldiers advancing. This reality highlights a central irony. The enemy responded to capability, while Allied institutions hesitated to acknowledge it fully within their own ranks during World War II. As fighting shifted eastward after the Ardennes, weather conditions gradually improved, enabling greater use of air power and armor. Infantry units, however, continued to bear the brunt of close combat, clearing towns and forests one position at a time. Black soldiers who had proven themselves during the emergency phase remained valuable assets, though policy often limited their continued employment in combat roles. This selective application of experience reflected an institution struggling to reconcile evidence with tradition. Letters written by soldiers during this period reveal evolving attitudes shaped by shared hardship. Descriptions of comradeship, trust, and reliance emerge alongside accounts of combat stress. These personal narratives provide insight into how prejudice eroded at the point of contact, even if it persisted elsewhere. In World War II, such localized change often preceded broader reform, driven by experience rather than ideology. The logistical backbone supporting Patton's operations remained heavily dependent on black units, particularly truck companies that sustained the rapid advance across France and into Germany. The famous Red Ball Express had already demonstrated how critical these soldiers were to operational tempo. The Ardennes crisis reinforced that lesson, showing that combat breakthroughs depended on supply as much as tactics. World War II warfare integrated frontline action with logistical depth, and segregated black soldiers were central to that integration. Military planners reviewing the campaign noted that manpower allocation had constrained options at critical moments. Had segregation policies been relaxed earlier, greater flexibility might have been available during crises like the Ardennes. This retrospective assessment did not immediately translate into change, but it contributed to an accumulating body of evidence that segregation imposed operational costs. In World War II, such costs became harder to justify as the conflict demanded maximum efficiency. The experiences of these soldiers also complicate narratives about Patton himself. Often portrayed as a singularly aggressive commander, his decisions during the Ardennes reveal a more pragmatic side. He adjusted plans rapidly, exploited available resources, and accepted unconventional solutions when necessary. Authorizing black soldiers for combat roles fit this pattern, illustrating how leadership under pressure can diverge from personal beliefs when outcomes are at stake. Training manuals and after-action reviews produced after the war increasingly emphasized adaptability and the efficient use of personnel. Though rarely explicit about race, these documents reflected lessons learned during World War II emergencies. The Ardennes episode served as an implicit example of how flexibility could avert disaster, even if institutional acknowledgement lagged behind operational reality. For historians, reconstructing these events requires careful examination of scattered records. Official documents often understate or omit the role of black soldiers in combat, necessitating reliance on unit histories, oral testimony, and correspondence. This methodological challenge highlights how historical memory is shaped not only by events, but by what institutions choose to record. World War II, despite its scale, left gaps that scholars continue to address. The psychological dimension of being temporarily accepted and then returned to segregated roles left a complex legacy for the soldiers involved. Pride in performance coexisted with frustration at continued exclusion. This emotional tension reflects a broader pattern in World War II service, where contributions did not always yield immediate recognition or change. Understanding this dynamic adds depth to assessments of morale and motivation within segregated forces. As Allied armies crossed into Germany, the focus shifted toward ending the war as quickly as possible. The momentum gained during the Ardennes counteroffensive proved decisive, preventing German forces from regrouping effectively. While strategic credit often centers on senior commanders and large formations, the cumulative effect of individual soldiers filling critical gaps cannot be overlooked. In World War II, such cumulative effects often determined whether operations succeeded or stalled. Post-war discussions about military integration drew indirectly on these experiences, even when they were not cited explicitly. The argument that segregated units limited flexibility resonated with policymakers seeking to modernize the armed forces. The practical lessons of World War II thus intersected with emerging political pressures, shaping decisions that would redefine military structure.
The Ardennes episode also underscores the importance of examining crises as moments of revelation. Under normal conditions, institutions can sustain inefficient practices. Under extreme stress, those practices are exposed. World War II created such stress repeatedly, forcing reevaluation of assumptions about manpower, leadership, and capability. The temporary integration of black soldiers during Patton's breakthrough exemplifies this process. Educational analysis of this period benefits from situating these events within the broader context of Allied operations. The success of the counteroffensive depended on coordination across armies, nations, and services. Within this coalition framework, the effective use of all available personnel became a strategic imperative. World War II thus offers a case study in how inclusivity can emerge not from idealism, but from necessity. The legacy of these soldiers' actions persists in military memory, even if recognition came slowly. Their role challenges simplified accounts of segregation as absolute and unchanging, revealing moments of permeability driven by circumstance. These moments matter, because they demonstrate that alternative approaches were possible, even within restrictive systems. In World War II, such possibilities were glimpsed in the heat of battle. Understanding how segregated black soldiers helped Patton break through German lines ultimately enriches comprehension of the Ardennes campaign itself. It adds layers to the narrative of recovery and advance, showing that success rested on more than command decisions and enemy mistakes. It depended on human resources mobilized under pressure, on individuals stepping into roles denied to them by policy, and on the capacity of organizations to adapt when survival demanded it. The after-effects of these wartime adaptations rippled unevenly through the immediate post-war army, where demobilization reduced forces rapidly and institutional habits reasserted themselves. Many of the same soldiers who had carried rifles through snow and fire were reassigned back to service units or discharged without acknowledgement of their combat roles. The Army's official histories of World War II emphasized divisional movements and command decisions, leaving little space for unconventional manpower solutions employed under duress. This selective memory reflected a desire to present coherence rather than contradiction in how the war had been fought. Yet within internal evaluations, the contradiction was impossible to erase completely. Staff officers reviewing the Ardennes campaign recognized that the crisis had exposed vulnerabilities in manpower policy. The inability to replace infantry losses quickly had nearly paralyzed offensive capability, forcing commanders to improvise. World War II had revealed that total war demanded total utilization, and any system that artificially constrained available talent carried inherent risk. These assessments circulated quietly, influencing professional military education even when they were not translated into public doctrine. The soldiers themselves carried forward lessons learned in combat, regardless of institutional response. Veterans recalled how trust was built rapidly when survival depended on cooperation, how shared danger stripped away abstractions. These memories contrasted sharply with the rigid segregation encountered in garrison life, highlighting the gap between battlefield reality and peacetime policy. In World War II, such gaps were common, But for those who experienced them firsthand, they underscored the arbitrariness of exclusion.
The Ardennes counteroffensive also reinforced the importance of small unit leadership in integrating unfamiliar personnel under fire. Non-commissioned officers played a crucial role, setting expectations, enforcing discipline, and modeling cooperation. Their ability to focus on immediate tasks rather than background differences enabled provisional units to function effectively. World War II repeatedly demonstrated that leadership at this level often determined whether rapid adaptations succeeded or failed. Comparative analysis with other Allied armies reveals that the U.S. approach to manpower was unusually constrained by segregation. British and Commonwealth forces, while not free of prejudice, employed colonial and minority troops in combat roles more routinely. This contrast became apparent to American officers observing coalition operations, prompting questions about whether U.S. policies were aligned with operational necessity. World War II thus provided an international context that challenged domestic assumptions. As the war moved toward its conclusion, the urgency that had driven improvisation diminished, allowing institutional inertia to regain strength. Temporary measures were framed as exceptions rather than precedents, limiting their immediate impact. Nevertheless, the memory of what had worked lingered among those who had witnessed it. In World War II, not all lessons were learned at once. Some required time and distance to be fully acknowledged. The historiography of the Ardennes has evolved to incorporate these complexities, shifting away from narratives that focus solely on dramatic reversals and heroic leadership. Modern scholarship emphasizes systems, logistics, and manpower as critical variables. Within this framework, the contribution of segregated black soldiers emerges as part of a broader pattern of adaptive responses that sustained Allied momentum. World War II, viewed through this lens, appears less as a series of predetermined victories and more as a succession of problems solved under pressure. Educational treatments of the campaign increasingly encourage critical examination of how policies shape outcomes. By analyzing why certain resources were underutilized until crisis struck, students gain insight into the costs of institutional bias. The Ardennes episode provides a concrete example of how exclusion can weaken organizations, while inclusion, even when reluctantly adopted, can enhance resilience. These lessons extend beyond military history, offering perspectives relevant to any large, complex institution. The personal cost of these adaptations also warrant attention. Soldiers thrust into combat roles without the promise of lasting change bore risks without guarantees of reward. Their willingness to serve under such conditions reflects both individual courage and a commitment to the broader mission. In World War II, motivations were complex, blending patriotism, hope for recognition, and the simple desire to survive and support comrades. The gradual accumulation of such experiences contributed to a post-war environment more receptive to reform. When policymakers debated desegregation in the late 1940s, they did so against a backdrop of wartime evidence that segregation had limited effectiveness. Though political considerations ultimately drove formal change, the practical lessons of World War II provided crucial support for those arguments. Revisiting Patton's breakthrough through this expanded perspective underscores how victory depended more than strategic brilliance or enemy error. It required human adaptability within flawed systems, moments when necessity overrode prejudice, and individuals who seized opportunities denied to them by policy. These dynamics complicate simplistic interpretations of World War II, revealing a conflict shaped as much by internal struggles as by external foes.